Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next avatar video. In this one I want to do a bit of a recap about some of the streams that I've been doing over the last couple of weeks. So you've probably seen these, I've been promoting them a little bit since it's been my first few streams that I've done. And so the streams basically resulted in 5 different top 10 lists. So top 10 Airbender, top 10 Waterbender, top 10 Earthbender, top 10 Firebender, and top 10 Non-Bender lists across 4 streams. So in terms of the time on those streams that we spent doing the lists, it probably is like 6-7 hours worth of discussion to cover all of these lists across the streams. And so I want to just do this video as sort of a recap to show you guys just all of the lists together in one video, with some of the discussion, some of the reasoning behind it, but not the full 6-7 hour experience basically. Because, you know, I could put up this video as just like a 5-second video, just a second on each thing, and have you guys scrub through it to find the lists. But I think people can be a little bit reactionary to just seeing the lists and that all they care about is the end result and just what the lists are. The reasoning is important. This list came together in a specific way, and like I said, we took our time. We didn't just throw it together. We put time, effort, arguments were made for pretty much every scenario, and we did our best to make these as much as possible. So again, this is a combination of like myself and the chat. It's not just my thoughts on it. Yes, in the end I made the decision on when we locked something in on the list, but I let the chat make the decision in a good few of the situations for sure, and I definitely brought their opinions into play as much as possible. So this is what we got. So we'll start with the Airbender list here. Here's the top 10. Tenzin, Gyatso, Kelsang, Afiko, Zahir, Jasa, Janora, Malu, Kai, Opal, and then I think the character who just about missed out was Milo, was sort of in contention for the number 10 slot, but I think we just about decided he's just a little bit too young, and even though we all agreed he's going to get better, it's hard to judge how much better he'll be because he still is very young. So this leaves the list as it is here. I think for the most part it came together pretty nicely. Opal, Kai as like the sort of best of the new young recruits of the new Airbenders made sense. Kai above Opal, most people tended to agree with. Malu from the trading card game we placed here just on the basis of she has experience from her time in the temple and then experience in the 100-Year War. That experience puts her just a little bit above these two, even though we don't maybe get to see as much of Malu as Kai and Opal in action. Then we get into the start of some of the Master Airbenders. The T means that they have arrow tattoos, so you'll note that Zahir is the only non-air nomad to make the list, but he's also the only non-tattooed character to break up the list of otherwise it being 7, tattooed characters in a row. So Janora we have as sort of the bottom of the Master Airbenders just because she is still new to it. She's more of a spiritual airbender than a combat focused airbender, and they don't show her in as many fights once she gets her tattoos. So she definitely, we all want to see her shine a little bit more in upcoming fights. Jasa is Kyoshi's mother, and we place her here because the book gets across. She was a very powerful airbender both during her time as an air nomad, getting her tattoos very young, but she also remained quite powerful as a Dao Fei despite the spiritual taint on her bending, so she deserved the spot here. We decided this is where Zahir goes. Even though Zahir has flight, against other airbenders we didn't really value flight that highly, and so we felt this is the spot for Zahir, just above a lot of the sort of high-end Master Airbenders that we get to see in action, but a bit above some of the other Master Airbenders who don't get to shine as much. I think this was the correct spot for him, just because he doesn't do airbending in the typical way. It's his own sort of style of airbending, which you can't value too highly. Flight adds his defensive capabilities, but I don't think it changes offensively too much for him. Afiko, again, above Zahir. This was a kind of interesting one in that, again, similar skill sets. He's a villainous airbender. He also has the taking air out of people's lungs technique, which is quite cool. But we placed him here. It felt fitting for him. We gave Kelsang the spot at 3 because his legend from the Rise of Kyoshi as, you know, the living typhoon. We felt he's worthy of the spot here, even if we don't get to see him in action in the present day of the book do too well. On his legend, he deserves to be here. And it's just because of that fact, it's why he doesn't really make it into the top 2. When it comes to the top 2, this is an interesting situation in that it was between Tenzin and Gyatso from the start, but the question was obviously the legend of Gyatso, even though we don't see him in action as much, versus Tenzin, who we do get to see in action, and we get to see a Master Airbender. I leant towards Tenzin over Gyatso just because, to me, there's not enough behind Gyatso to really, I think, place him as being sort of a level or 2 above Tenzin. To me, Tenzin is a Master Airbender. Gyatso is a Master Airbender. And I don't quite see what is there with Gyatso that puts him at sort of Master level plus. I wish we knew if he did have a little bit more that was unique to him. Because there's only so much you can read into what he did during the Ernoma genocide. Obviously, the idea is he took out a lot of airbenders with him. We don't know exactly how he did it, but he was skilled enough that he went down while defending his home, and he did very well. And the cards get that across especially well. But Tenzin also has amazing showings, and ultimately, the level of opponents he went up against, the amount of times we see him in action, I think we had to give it to Tenzin. But 1 and 2 was very close. Moving on to the Waterbender list. This list is Katara, Unalaq, Paku, Minghua, Hama, Tagaka, Tonraq, Kaya, Eska/Desna, and Amok. Note, Amon, Yakone, and Tarlok were not really in contention for this because we just felt psychic bloodbending and bloodbending without the need of the full moon is just too powerful of an ability that it would just lock these 3 characters in the number 3 slots and just make the list less interesting because it would be such a default decision. There's no discussion to be had here. We all acknowledge that they're incredibly powerful because of that ability, but it takes away 3 interesting slots on the list to discuss. So we just said, let's leave them out and fill it in with the rest of the characters here. So I think the character who just about missed off in terms of the number 11 slot is the likes of Kinto, Hugh, and Kirima, I think, are the characters who kind of come roughly after our top 10. But yeah, what we got here is that, yeah, we pretty much early on decided Katara, Unalaq, Paku, Minghua, those are the 4 characters who are going to be in the top 4. I don't really think anyone else is in contention. We also decided very early on Katara, Unalaq are going to be the 2 fighting for the number 1 and 2 slots, and we'll come back to it. Paku got locked in relatively early on at number 3, ahead of Minghua, who got locked in at 4. Hama, you know, people got behind Hama and the combination of inventing a skill like bloodbending, even though we weren't really factoring in for Katara and Hama bloodbending because you can only use it during the full moon. We gave some credit to Hama for inventing that technique. That's always a notable skill as a bender if you can create a technique, and she does. But that in combination with, she was the last waterbender standing during the invasion of the South by the Fire Nation, and what she then later does, being the puppet master and putting up a decent show against Katara despite the age difference between the 2 of them. She was deserving of a spot very high up as being a noted master waterbender. Tagaka we placed here again. Just it was a tough one here between the likes of Tagaka, Tonraq, Kaya, Eska, Desna, just because they're all in or around the same level. We gave it to Tagaka just because her feats on the iceberg were quite impressive. She does defeat Yoon even though she has the complete advantage against him, and it does take 3 people to eventually take her out. So a combination of just her nice tactics as a leader and just being a surprisingly skilled waterbender, give her the slot here. But maybe if we learn more about her, she might come down just a little bit. But 6, I think most people were happy with. Tonraq ahead of Kaya, and then Kaya ahead of Eska Desna. The thing with Eska Desna is that they always fight together, and I think that ends up sort of working against them because you don't get to see what each of them individually is like, because it's always a 2-on-1 or whatever with them. They're obviously both very skilled. That has to be noted, but I don't know what necessarily is there that makes them stand out in particular when arguably their main skill is working together as a duo perfectly. And then Kaya performed so well against Minghua and against Zahir. We gave her the edge over Eska Desna just as an individual bender. Tonrock is just, the physicality, his unique physical style worked well for him here. Amok was just an interesting one in that we felt him versus the likes of Hugh, Kinto, Kirima, it has to be him over them, but we don't see him bend enough, so he kind of just got the 10 slot by virtue of the fact that he's meant to be very skilled. Jonju chooses him as Yoon's waterbending teacher for a reason, but we don't see him in action, so 10 felt like the right spot for him. And then Katara Unalaq, I'm at times accused of being biased towards Unalaq, so I sort of took a little bit of a step back from overly arguing this point, because I was fine with it either way. Everyone seemed to agree that these were the top two. I was fine with it being Katara Unalaq or it being Unalaq Katara. I let the chat more or less go with the idea that, yeah, they went with Katara over Unalaq, and I can see it. It obviously gets a little bit into the situation of it's to some degree accounting for the fact that Katara will grow and get better as she ages as a bender. Because if she's this good at 14, 15, 16, imagine how good she's going to be when she's 24. And instead of only having 2 or 3 years experience as a skilled bender, imagine she has 10 years of experience behind her. That sort of thing. She's now in her physical prime, so her energy network is as, big as it's going to get. It's as developed as it needs to be. She can now utilize her bending to its maximum from a sort of physicality point of view, which is an advantage the adults tend to have over the younger characters. And so I think there's some value in accounting for that. Otherwise, you're kind of saying, well, Unalaq is better just because he performs better feats, but some of that is because he's just older than Katara and has more experience and is fully grown. So, I'm fine with that. The likes of, say, Katara Toph are absolutely characters who you're aware of. They're already amazing. Give them a handful of more years and they're going to be, a little bit better, and that little bit puts them more in line with, that distinguishes them. It puts them ahead of, their opponents. And I think that's roughly something I agree with. 2 for Unalaq is no slight against him. He's still very, very powerful. But yeah, that's the Waterbender list. Some people might argue Paku should be higher up, but I think he has a set limit. He's still, we don't see enough of the idea of does he incorporate Southern style in at all? Does he have the experience with the other elements that Katara does? Does he have the unique moveset that Unalaq does? I'm not quite sure. So he's here ahead of Minghua for sure, and I think that's fine. Moving on to the Earthbender list, we went with Toph Bumi, Jonju, Kuvira, Bolin, Lao Ge, Yoon, pre-Glowworm, Gazan, Suyin, and Lin, with the idea being that the Earthbender list works out perfectly where those 10 characters stand out clearly above all other characters, in that the next character up you'd say is someone like a Wong perhaps, a Long Fang, an Ai Wei, a Xin Fu, maybe a General Fong perhaps in here. Someone like that is probably your 11, 12, but all those characters are so close, of the high up Earth Kingdom generals, the Dai Li style characters, the best of the Earth Rumbles. They're pretty close overall, so it's probably the tougher decision deciding who comes next rather than who makes up the top 10. So we pretty much, I think, came to the conclusion early on that, of this list, Suyin, Lin are towards the bottom. Suyin above Lin because we rate Kuvira quite highly, and you'd say Suyin's skill set is closer to Kuvira's than Lin's is. But Lin is still really, really good and makes the top 10 quite clearly. Of course, we locked it in straight away. It is a case of it is going to be Toph or Bumi for number 1 and 2. Jonju, I think we settled on being a set number 3 quite early on. The same with Kuvira at 4, that came together quite clearly. I think maybe it's a little bit of Kyoshi novel hype, but I think the hype is justified with a character like Jonju, where they get across his style, his power, his approach. He really comes across. He has the feats on screen. He has the legend, the legacy behind him. He has the unique style, and he's willing to go for the kill. You know, that comes together quite nicely for him, and you'd say, yeah, he probably would be able to deal with metal if he saw it. And while I suppose it's relatively close between Jonju and Kuvira, I'm fine right now with saying Jonju ahead of Kuvira. He's just like, he does some very impressive things in the novels. So the top 4 kind of was locked outside of deciding Toph Boomy at the end, which left this interesting bit in the middle, Bolin, Lauga, Yoon, Gazan, where it's an interesting thing of like, Lauga's difficult to place because he's meant to be here, there and thereabouts, but he's an assassin, so he's a bit of a unique character where he maybe doesn't quite have the one-on-one power level if he goes up against you dead on, but I wouldn't bet against him not being really well. So the rough explanation for this is just that we said that Lauga versus, say, a lava bender and an intelligent lava bender like Bolin, I'm not sure he's quite going to be able to get the handle on that. Bolin is accurate and precise with his earthbending. He's very skilled at that. And the lava just puts him a little bit of level probably above Lauga. Whereas, of course, Lauga's skills, you'd say, is maybe a little bit more on the assassination side of things, the stealth, and we don't get quite the sense for like what his power, earthbending power level is, but he still has a lot going for him. Yoon is interesting because we're talking about him pre-Glowworm, not post-Glowworm, so that means he is not anywhere near as good as he was in Shadow of Kyoshi. But he's still very good. He is still said to be one of the best benders of his generation. Now, that doesn't immediately mean he's up there 1, 2, 3, because you're meant to view all of these characters as being the best of their generations, of course. That's just the way these lists end up working out. And I went with him here, just a little bit above Gazan, because he's meant to be intelligent, he's amazing with the precision and his connection to Earth. He's got good battle tactics because he was trained by a mock, so he has sort of assassination training. He knows how to survive a battle, how to go for the kill, that sort of thing. He just lacks in power before he consumes Glowworm. If we were talking post-Glowworm Yoon, he would be number 1 as an Earthbender. He just is. I don't think there's a debate. But without that, I think just the lack of power brings him just a little bit down here, and I think the likes of Bolin, Lauga would be able to get the advantage. Looking at the list there, I understand it makes it feel like Gazan is maybe placed a little bit out of position, but Book 4 Bolin, obviously, as we saw in Book 3, Bolin has the earthbending. They were even pretty much as Earthbender on Earthbender, but the lava bending is what gave Gazan the edge. And even then, Bolin's basic, literally just learned the ability lava bending, was able to keep him in that fight for a solid amount of time. So Bolin, with 3 years of experience of being a lava bender and what he does in Book 4, to me is like, okay, he's a more controlled bender than Gazan. I wouldn't necessarily say that just because Gazan is willing to take down an air temple, he's by default better, because what does it mean in a one-on-one fight if you take down the temple you're standing in? You've just killed both yourselves, because the lava bender is still vulnerable to their own lava, and I think Bolin is just more controlled. So that's why we said Bolin above Gazan. And then it would have felt weird, like Lauga down here, Yoon down here. It's a tough one. I maybe, if I was to change anything, would be like Yoon below Gazan, but I think this roughly makes sense. Toph Boomy, like Katara Unalaq, is always going to be a little bit of a debate, because Boomy is so experienced. He has such easy power as a bender, and his connection to the earth from a distance that not a lot of other benders showcase is impressive. Toph, of course, we get to see her bend so much. She invents a metal bending. That's very notable. And I think it's quite kind of easy with Toph to assume that, like, okay, she gets better in the future. We know she becomes the chief of police, so she starts wearing the armor. She has the metal spools of metal, kind of rods that she uses, like the other metal bender police officers. So you can see sort of where she goes from a technique point of view to improve herself, while still having good earth bending. because if you were just to rate it as like 12, 13, 14-year-old Toph versus Boomy, I would still give the edge to Boomy, but I'm willing to accept that Toph does get to the point where, again, when she's fully grown, when her energy system and her body is fully grown, she is a little bit more. That little advantage is enough to probably just about, I think, give her the edge, with the idea that a lot of fans think that way anyway, that Toph is maybe slightly better than Boomy, so adding on just that Toph has room to grow, Boomy doesn't, I'm fine with that, even though I know some people will argue the reverse, but then you're not accounting for the fact that there's such an age difference between the characters, when I think it does need to be factored in from a technical point of view, but only to a certain degree, so it is tricky. But I don't think many people are disagreeing with the idea that it's close, and at most, like, what, we were off by like one position with a character here or there. It's tough. Here's the Firebender list. This was kind of the most controversial one. So what we came out with in the end was Iroh, Ozai, Azula, Zhang, Mako, Zuko, Sozin, Iroh 2, Rangi, and Heiran, with I think Zhu Ping An and Lightning Bolt Zolt being the characters that were in contention for the number 10 slot with Heiran, but we went with Heiran's experience, her victory in all of those Fire Nation, the Agni Kais, as the thing that gave her the edge over the Lightning Benders. Now, this list was interesting because with the Earthbending list, you only factor in the difference in skill sets of, like, you know, ooh, a character has metal bending. It's not necessarily the be-all, end-all advantage over a normal Earthbender. Similarly, lava bending is not so dominant of an ability that it immediately gives a character an advantage. The earth abilities sort of flow together where there's like pluses and minuses to each of them. In this case, though, having lightning is a kind of notable skill to have. Having redirection is notable, and I think it creates a little bit more of a distinction between the characters here. So you can see there's some differences, like Zhang is up here, even though he doesn't have lightning redirection or generation. Sozin is here, he doesn't have either as far as we're aware, and then like Zuko only has redirection but no generation, and there's stuff like that. So again, this was one where I think the top four sort of decide itself. I don't think anyone's really disagreeing with some combination of Iroh, Ozai, Azula, Zhang as being the top four. I think most fans would tend to agree with the idea of Iroh, Ozai, Azula as being the top three, which I felt locked Zhang in at number 4. And I did everything I could, I think, with Zhang. I gave him all the credit in the world for the uniqueness of his character and his defensive firebending, being an old master for firebending, and just being very, very impressive and unique. But I think it only takes him this far. And I know, and I get it, look, that's going to upset some Zhang fans who feel he should be higher. But you have to be reasonable and acknowledge that it's not really a problem that Iroh, Ozai, and Azula are the only characters above him on the list. Again, we weren't factoring in Pali or Combustion Man because Combustion Bending is so difficult to deal with, where depending on the environment, the Combustion Benders can beat anyone, but in the wrong environment, most standard Firebenders probably could defeat a Combustion Bender if the situation is in their favor. It's so difficult to maneuver around. So that was that. The top 4 more or less decided itself. The order was a bit tricky. Heiran, Rangi, Iroh 2 ended up being pretty locked in from the get-go. Was like, yeah, that feels about the right order. Sozin, there was a bit of a discussion about should Sozin be here or should he be at 5? Like, basically, should the grouping of Mako and Zuko, who are going to be right next to each other, should they be below or ahead of Sozin? I made the argument, and I think people ended up agreeing with it in the end, of just that we don't see Sozin in action enough to, I think, quite justify placing him in the same echelon as an Iroh, as an Ozai. Theoretically, he's meant to be there and thereabouts, but a lot of his major decisions as a character are leadership decisions rather than directly bending feats. He obviously gets across that he is a master firebender and he has the heat redirection and stuff like that, but I just find it tricky to compare a character who you only see bend a handful of times and are sort of told he's really good versus literally probably on the list 2 of the firebenders we see firebend the most in the entire series, in the entire franchise. So that was that. Mako Zuko always going to be a bit of a challenge. I've always lent towards Mako over Zuko, and I explained this, I think, kind of well on the stream, which I think is what got people behind the decision in the end, to where this was not a controversial decision, at least on the stream. There were so many other ones that people felt stronger about than this. And I think it's when you properly analyze it outside of the popularity contest of like which is your favorite character, skill set wise, Mako having lightning generation and redirection is a noted advantage that he has over Zuko only having redirection. Sure, you will say that maybe Zuko is slightly better as just a standard firebender because he has a few more power moves, but in terms of agility, like Mako maybe has a slight edge over Zuko, and there's all these like slight differences, but when it comes down to it, it's like if a character has lightning and redirection over someone who just has redirection, you have to give it to the character who has both abilities over the other one. That's what happened when Zuko and Azula fought, when Azula revealed she had redirection. But it's tough. I could see it being either way. I went with this because, again, it's my channel, it is my list, and people didn't really disagree with it too much at the time. There was much more controversial stuff, like I said. Some people were arguing Zhang should be much higher up than this. But the main thing actually ended up being less sort of Iroh being number one and more like Azula, people who are really big fans of Azula and wanting Azula placed high, feeling that Azula should be 2 or 1 and really, really trying hard to make the argument. For me, I think Iroh sort of just has to be 1 in terms of like a combination of he has the legend as a character, and we see him firebend enough to get across that his style of firebending is really good and it stands out. Ozai is interesting because he is hyped up as being a character where only Iroh or Aang are meant to be able to defeat him. So that immediately places it in terms of the firebending list as like Ozai at least is meant to be in the top 2. If not the top 1, because he has such a legacy behind him, as we are told he is the big bad. And I only want to like lean into that to a certain degree, but not too much. I leant away from it too much in the initial list that I did like a few years ago when I had him at like 5 or 6. That was, I think, wrong in reflection, and he should be more like here. The argument ended up being more about Ozai Azula, and should Azula not be above Ozai because she has more feats to her name versus Ozai only fighting really during the comet. But this is where again legacy has to come into play, and we've had ones where the reputation of a character goes one way or the other, in that we went with Tenzin over Gyatso, but we went with Katara and Toph over Bumi and Unalaq. On those respective lists, because each situation is ultimately different, and this is just an unfortunate one where Ozai is such an extreme situation of he has the biggest legacy and reputation of a character, but we are shown so little of him, and you have to factor that legacy as being so high. That this is what I came up with, and this is what I stick with, and that if we had switched this around, like Ozai number 1, Azula 2, Iroh 3, that feels crazy for Iroh, that he's only number 3. We swap that around and it's like, okay, what about Azula, Iroh, Ozai? And it's like, I don't think Azula's that high. Because Azula's interesting because she's obviously really, really strong, a prodigy. But her skills kind of do go up and down depending on her mental state, and we don't know going forward if she's going to get better or worse, where her arc goes, because it is a major character arc in flux at the moment, and it's hard to really place that. Where she is now, she is really good. Having lightning redirection in addition to generation is very, very strong. But the way Ozai is kind of presented is just that he is a powerhouse, and is the lightning going to be enough to just take out someone that strong? It's difficult the whole time to do that, in that there was major arguments afterwards with this in the comments about like Azula should be above Ozai, Azula should be above Iroh, and that sort of stuff. Zhang should be in the middle of this as well. And it's so difficult because any order creates a different group of people who are angry. Iroh fans, Ozai fans, Azula fans. I don't think I'm biased towards or against any of these three characters, and this is the way I feel it is on the basis of sort of factoring everything in. Just about. And even I think it's like super close. We move on to the non-bender list here. So we have Piandao, Suki, Ty Lee, Jet, Asami, Sokka, Hakoda, Tokuga, pre-Spirit Morph, Mei, and the Lieutenant, with Longshot. He was the character who just missed out. We had a bit of a discussion here about the archers. We agreed that Longshot is better than a Vashir and kind of a Yuyan archer style thing. So he's the best archer. But is an archer too specialized to make it high up on the list? And we ultimately came to the agreement that, like, yeah, we're viewing it as being more of a one-on-one fight perspective style thing here, rather than, you know, if you needed someone as part of your fighting team, you'd probably have an archer in your team and you'd probably choose Longshot. But again, it's kind of like the combustion benders. In the right situation, starting the fight from long distance, the archer has the advantage and might be able to defeat a lot of these characters before they get in close. If the fight starts too up close, the advantage is too far against the archer. And we found, like, again, it's too difficult. 11 is unfortunate, but it's also pretty high up for a very specialized character like that. So we agreed that Longshot just about misses out on the list and that this is the top 10. So we pretty much came to the conclusion that at that point that Mei and the Lieutenant are sort of the two kind of bottom characters. We went with Mei over the Lieutenant just because the Lieutenant isn't presented particularly well after the early episodes of Korra, in that he loses a lot of his fights, and even early on, while he threatens a lot of the Benders quite a bit and challenges them, he still gets kind of defeated in the end. So just that lack of properly getting the complete victories in his fights kind of hurts him a little bit. And then Mei, after a little bit of discussion back and forth, we got to the conclusion that, okay, she's primarily ranged, but can defend herself in close as well. The fact that she's not full on like archer and is more firing kind of needles and knives allows her to use knives up close if she needs to, but also act from a distance. So kind of more mid-range fighter. So that is useful, and she is skilled and has been shown to do quite well against even some good benders from time to time. But it might be a little lightweight against anyone who's really good up close and is more of a melee fighter, that she might struggle. So Mei is a little bit specialized, which kind of keeps her out of the upper echelons, but we felt it was a good situation for her here. Tokuga was an interesting one to place just because he's written to have all the skills in the world. He has Jet's hook swords. He's cool. He's the new leader of the Triple Threat Triads. He can chi block as well. And he's an amazing leader. So it's like he's written as the absolute like coolest guy in the world. But no one really thinks he's actually that good. So we felt 8 was a nice place to put him, where like Hakoda's battle experience, a lot of the other characters maybe intelligence or just technique advantage would be better than him, who's maybe more of a jack of all trades. So 8 was a nice position to put him in, and again, we were not considering Tokuga with the extra abilities he gains after becoming morphed by the spirit. I think at this point we did the top 3. We decided very early on Piandao, Suki, Ty Lee in some order will be the top 3, and we just decided, okay, let's lock them in at some point. We'll make the decision a bit later on. I made the decision, like, I think Jet's 4 quite early on. Some people argued Asami should be ahead of Jet, but I think people in the end were able to agree that no, Jet is like right up there as being one of the best swordsmen that we see. He's he's a good leader. He's aggressive but not stupid when he fights, and is just very dynamic, and it's going to be tough for a lot of characters to actually face him. Just stuff like the fight he has against Aang is very impressive in that that's an environment that works for both Jet and Aang. But he was able to actually get the advantage in that fight. So Jet is very skilled, and I think while he's not the most like super intelligent character like say an Asami or a Sokka, who's more of like an ideas guy, and Asami's pure intelligence. I think just in terms of like a battle kind of leader, the leader of the freedom fighters, that is kind of a valuable skill set. But I think technique wise he has an advantage, and just the weaponry advantage, I think, over kind of Asami. I'd always go for him over Asami, which left us with an interesting situation of Hakoda, Sokka, Asami. I think we all agree that Hakoda probably falls at this point and goes in at 7, which left us with the really interesting decision of Asami, Sokka, which way do we go? There were arguments back and forth about the pros and cons for each of them. It ultimately amounted to, effectively, the way Asami is presented is both her strength and weakness as a non-bender fighter. She pretty much wins all of the fights she participates in, but the fights she participates in are fights she should win. She's never challenged necessarily in any fight, and that makes it very hard to judge, are we overrating her by placing her this high up, or is she always put in a position where she's always against an opponent that she's a level above? It's very difficult, but ultimately it's clear she is a character with very strong technique, with the hand-to-hand combat skills that she has, her agility, and the really strong weapon in the shock glove. That is a recipe to do well as a non-bender fighter, and she uses it well. And we just felt that technique-wise, she probably does have an edge against Sokka, who is still kind of in training. He is not particularly known for just being the guy who is just super skill, super technique. He makes up for that disadvantage there by having clever ideas. But so Sokka works a little bit better as a group, as the support non-bender in the group, the non-bender support to a bender rather than specifically one-on-one. We still rate him high enough one-on-one that we think at some point he surpasses his father because of the sword skills from Piandao. But Asami might have just the edge on just raw technique. But it was tough. It was really tough because it was all about the people who were sort of maybe overrating Asami on the basis of her fights versus the people who were undervaluing her because she's not involved in any notable fight necessarily. So somewhere in the middle, roughly, I felt like, yeah, this was the right way to go. Which left us with the decision, Piandao, should he be 1 or 3? I made the argument, and I think this convinced everyone pretty much, that Piandao over Suki Tai Li. Piandao is the master swordsman. He is the master swordsman in the series. He focuses on that one thing. Can Suki and Tai Li do anything against that? And the answer really was no. That they have a lot going for them, Suki and Tai Li, but just can they out technique? Can they break through Piandao's guard? Can they block an onslaught from him if he came at them? And the answer was really I'm not sure. I don't think he can. And it was just on the basis of just on raw technique. He's unmatched, I feel. Sure, we don't see him fight a lot, but he has the legacy behind him. Order of the White Lotus, best swordsman that we've seen. And he's still pretty agile for his age. I don't think Suki and Tai Li, where they'd use their agility to try and get the advantage, I don't think they'd be able to break through the technique that he has. So that's what settled him as number 1. And then it left probably the hardest decision of the whole thing, which was Suki versus Tai Li, because they're so dead even. And we discussed this back and forth over and over again. I went through their skill sets probably 2 or 3 times over and over again. And I think what ultimately decided this in the end was that someone in the chat brought up Suki in the Boiling Rock on top of the gondola fights Tai Li one-on-one. They have a hand-to-hand combat fight. This is a situation where it should be in Tai Li's favor, because Tai Li is at her best when she's using her main skill, her agility and her chi blocking. She is in her element in this fight, versus Suki, who doesn't have her armor, doesn't have her sword, shield, fans, any of her equipment, just her martial arts training. She defends well, pushes the advantage. It's a back and forth, it's an even fight between Suki and Tai Li, when Tai Li should have the advantage here, but she doesn't get it. So you then flash forward to Tai Li is now a Kyoshi warrior. They've exchanged skills. So Suki now has chi blocking and is very skilled at it. Ty Lee now wears Kyoshi Warrior armor and has the equipment. But this is probably the key thing. We are never really shown in the comics that Ty Lee utilizes the weaponry of the Kyoshi Warrior that much. So you would say Suki's skill at the thing that the opponent is best at is better than the thing Ty Lee is kind of not as good at on Suki's side of thing. In that Suki is a better chi blocker than Ty Lee is a sort of weapons expert as like a Kyoshi Warrior. So we know their hand-to-hand combat is going to result in sort of a tie. So when they switch over to doing weapons versus weapons, that has to be the advantage to Suki. With the only thing that Ty Lee would have the advantage at that point is that Ty Lee is a tiny bit more agile than Suki, but it is not so big an advantage that I think it would give Ty Lee the fight. It's tough because you can bring up feats either way, but we put this one to a vote in the chat, and what came out in the end was that Suki won by like 1 or 2 votes. It was really, really close, but Suki just got it. I think people were convinced by that kind of point in chat that I kind of brought up. Really close. It was definitely probably the closest one in the whole thing, because these two characters at this point are so close in skill level at this point, but they're both really, really good. So there is the non-bender list, and yeah, that's it. That's the recap of like, what was it, like 7 hours of discussion condensed down into like 40 minutes. I think it was important to go over some of the explanations again to get across that this wasn't just thrown together in a handful of minutes. Thought was given to pretty much every scenario, and look, you're allowed to disagree. Of course, your list is allowed to be different. This was just what me, plus the chat during those live streams, came up with. Disagreements are always going to happen because this is not the correct list. It's just the list that we came out with in the end. But what I will say is, I don't think any character is fundamentally just completely out of position. You can disagree on like some of these things, like Katara Unalak, or like Paku Minghua, or like Yoon should be like 5 instead of 7 or something like that. But fundamentally, the characters are in generally the range that they should be in. I get people are going to get upset about the placement of these characters, but fundamentally, is it really a problem that we in general acknowledge how close some of these positions are, but that the decision we made was Azula's top 3, but maybe not top 2? Is that really that much of a problem? Especially when Ozai now doesn't have his bending, and so, you know, Azula takes the top 2 spot where we are kind of now, from a timeline kind of perspective, but that wasn't the way the list was being formed. You know, that sort of thing. So, yeah, in the comments, let me know what your thoughts were on the list. Whether you were in the chat during these or you missed them, what are your thoughts? Probably is going to be a few more years before I come back to this again. It was just such heavy, intense discussion over these last couple of weeks. Definitely need a break from doing the kind of power level discussion stuff, because it's just like, it's so head melting at times because you're trying to factor in everything, and it's kind of impossible at a certain point. So there is the recap of the list. So yeah, like I said, let me know your thoughts in the comments below, but that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.